So here we are, lost in your quantum world of probabilities and needing certainty.
On this day, when we remember those who lost their lives in one of the greatest security failures this nation has experienced, we thought it fitting to reconsider the resultant growth of the expanded national security state and the way it reaches into each and every one of our lives. Were it not for the brave work of our two guests, we wouldn't know the half of it. Edward Snowden is a former intelligence officer who served the CIA, NSA, and DIA for nearly a decade as a subject matter expert on technology and cybersecurity. In 2013, he shook the pillars of the worldwide intelligence community when he revealed a trove of highly classified information that exposed the U.S. surveillance overreach on a variety of international and domestic levels. Along with Daniel Ellsberg, Glenn Greenwald, and Laura Poitras, Mr. Snowden is a member of the board of the Freedom of the Press Foundation, and he currently works on methods of enforcing human rights through the application and development of new technologies. Tonight, Mr. Snowden will be in conversation with Jeremy Scahill, an investigative journalist, co-founder of the journal The Intercept, and the best-selling author of the books Blackwater, Dirty Wars, and The Assassination Complex. It is my honor to welcome Edward Snowden and Jeremy Scahill to the Free Library of Philadelphia.
I just want to give you a chance to say hello here to everybody in Philadelphia at the Free Library.
Hello, Philly. Gotta say, I might not be able to see them, but they're making sure I can hear them.
Excellent. Well, before we get into the actual questions that I want to ask you, I want to also let people know that we do intend to try to get through as many of your questions as possible that were gathered on the note cards. As Ed himself will acknowledge, he is not the briefest of speakers, but we are going to, he does know that there's a lot of people that want to ask a lot of questions. We're going to jump right to it, but very quickly, Ed, I just want to read you some of the questions that I was suggested on Twitter to ask you that I'm not really going to ask you, but I thought I would share them with you. Apparently people think you're omniscient. We get a lot of emails from people asking us if Snowden can search their name in the archive. One person asked, can Jesus make a burrito so hot that not even he could eat it? Ask Ed about his favorite cat meme. There's a question that I actually think is very good about Game of Thrones. Is the Night King actually a time-traveling Bran Stark? Can you get Trump's search history? Maybe they're not aware of where you are right now, Ed, but, or maybe they are. What happened to the real Snowden in Moscow? Did you get your final paycheck from Booz Allen? Someone says that they went
Still
to...
waiting on that one.
What's there's two more. Someone says they went to their marijuana dispensary in Colorado and there is a strain with your name on it. I don't even know what to say. And then finally, and I actually am going to have you answer this one, how do you take your cheesesteaks?
You know, I actually have the most boring cheesesteaks in the world. I like cheese, I like steak, I like lettuce, I like mayonnaise, and that's it.
Whoa. Whiz or no whiz?
Man,
Don't pull a
don't
John
like it.
Kerry and ask for Swiss cheese, man.
I can't tell you about the burrito thing, though. You know, I don't know about Jesus, but I'm pretty sure that Jesus could.
All right. Enough of that chicanery with Ed Snowden. Because it is the anniversary of 9/11, and this was the first year that MSNBC did not air the 24 hours of coverage on the Today Show, which has become a sort of annual ritual, and we have Donald Trump as president. Barack Obama, just left the presidency about half a year ago. On 9/11, George W. Bush and Dick Cheney were in the White House. Given your experience in the intelligence community and also your whistleblowing, how did 9/11 change the character of the United States, and how did it impact the world?
Yeah, this is a extraordinarily complex question. When historians look at this, they're going to see that the United States government has always functioned in a very delicate balance. We want to think that the best things about our country are eternal, they're undying, they'll just be there no matter what we do. But positive futures and good government are not inevitable. These are things that we have to fight for. These are things that we have to work for all of the time. And this is most important in times of extraordinary pressure, right, of criticism, of risk. The hardest thing in the world politically after 9/11 was to go, we need to make sure that we're not undermining the rights of Americans and people around the world reflexively to enable these agencies to go do what they say they want to do, that they say is necessary, right? And this is hard because if you think about it at the moment, it obviously seemed necessary, right? These are things that no one wants to question, no one wants to get in the way of. This was an unprecedented tragedy. And yet, at the same time, the Patriot Act that was crammed through in the wake of 9/11 had already been written. This thing was already sitting on the shelf for years and years and years, and they had never been able to pass it. They had never been able to pass it. And the question is, why, when it wasn't so necessary before, had it suddenly become necessary now, right? And now, let's presume, right, they were telling the truth. All of these agencies were right. The lack of laws were the reason that 9/11 happened, right? And now they had changed the laws, so we'll no longer have any more terrorist attacks. Well, we've continued to have terrorist attacks since then. But the most interesting thing is in the wake of 2013, right, when I came forward and journalists revealed what had happened with the mass surveillance, not just of terrorists abroad, but of ordinary Americans within the United States who were not suspected of any criminal wrongdoing, right? They just collected the communications of everyone because why not? They could. It was cheap. It was free. And the thing is, when the Obama White House was forced to investigate these claims, right, President Barack Obama appointed 2 different independent commissions. The President's Review Group on Intelligence and Communications Technologies and the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board also did their own investigation. And again, these are packed with Washington insiders, right? These are sort of a who's who of my greatest critics, including former Deputy Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, Michael Morrell. And the CIA guys looking at all these reports, going into the FBI, the NSA, looking at all the classified documents about the effectiveness of these programs, said that despite operating for more than 10 years, despite all the terrorist attacks that had happened, despite the fact that, the threat is ongoing, it's real, is that it never stopped a single terrorist attack in the United States, right? Like, that is the bottom line. Now, this happened when it was secret. This happened when nobody knew about it. If it wasn't saving lives, then how was it so necessary? And this is only one tiny fraction of a gigantic omnibus bill. And why do I get into this when you say, how did it change the national character? What this means is that delicate balance that we talked about initially here, where these sort of governmental powers exist not only in perfect tension with each other, a delicate tension that could be thrown out of balance with any given election, actually fell out of balance with the public, with the people of the United States. We had suddenly become radically disempowered against our government. Traditionally in this country, right, we have an idea, we have an argot, a language where we describe ideas such as private citizens and public officials. But suddenly this became inverted. And now we had public citizens where the government knew everything about us, and we knew nothing about what the government was doing. And this has continued, right? And what this actually reflects is an aggregation, an accretion of power amongst a very few officials, right? And meanwhile, we have the gigantic mass of ordinary American people who have less influence. They have less access to resources, whether we're talking material wealth, whether we're talking political influence, than they have in decades. You know, when we talk about rising inequality, we are typically talking about the commercial sector, right? We're talking about that CEOs are basically robbing the United States blind at the same time where the ordinary people, you know, whether we're talking about teachers, firefighters, policemen, you know, nurses, have less and less with each passing year. It's all too easy to lose that big picture dynamic that doesn't happen in a day. It happens over decades, where we are losing our equality of influence over the direction, the future of our country. This is a difficult thing to say on this day, but there is really very little controversy inside the intelligence community that September 11th was a preventable attack. And people who are in politics, right, they want to say the reason that this occurred was because we didn't have the right laws. Well, we know now, we have the history, we have the evidence that this was not the case, and we had the suspicion that this was not the case in the beginning. But the reality of why this attack happened was something fundamentally different and unfortunately much more painful, which was we had all of the intelligence we needed to stop this attack, right? But government officials who are my critics, you know, say this. The 9/11 report says this. But the problem here that is not said, that is left unstated in these things, government officials like to talk about silos. They like to talk about how the rules, the regulations we had kept these agencies from sharing information. And that's not actually true, right? I worked at CIA. I worked at NSA. If I wanted information, I just had to write an email. And this is the way it's always been. You could pick up the phone and make a call. This is not just something that happened post-September 11th. The reality is bureaucratic turf wars, the unsexy political problems that no one ever wants to think about, can cost lives catastrophically. And this is the case where it happened. The FBI had some information. The CIA had some information. The NSA had some information. And because none of them had all of the information, but they had part of the information, they thought it was interesting. They thought this was a plot that would be busted. They knew the names of these kind of guys. They knew who they were talking to, and they went, oh, we're going to unravel this plot. But none of them wanted to share credit with the other agencies. They didn't want to open the vest and go, hey, let's make this a team effort. Instead, they were trying to save their parts of information so that they could get credit for inevitably busting this when it happened. The problem is, when you do that too often, actually anytime you do that, you're taking a chance that when you guys aren't working together like this, something will slip through. And that's what's happened. And that's the greatest tragedy that we have not confronted. We have not reconciled. We have improved processes on the edges. We have tried to make things work a little bit better. But the fundamental problem here is when we have people who are playing politics with lives. They're trying to build domains inside their agencies, inside their offices. They're following policy prerogatives rather than furthering the public interest. It's a recipe for catastrophe.
Briefly, do you believe that the Patriot Act in its current iteration should be completely repealed? Is there any part of it you would keep in place?
Well, you know, the problem with the Patriot Act is it's so big that really no one understands it. They didn't have a chance even to read this before it was passed. So I don't want to go out on a limb and say, oh, there's nothing good in this bill, because it's massive. Even people who study it don't know everything that's in it off the top of their head. I will say, when we look at what it has achieved for us in the last decade, there are no clear cases where the Patriot Act has saved lives. And I think that's fundamentally a problem, because we know for a fact that rather than the theoretical benefits it could be providing in counterterrorism, we have concrete harms to the way we live, to our relationship in the United States between the governing and the governed. And when we live in a moment of democratic fragility, as we do now in this political moment with this White House, We need to think about what we can do as citizens to reset that balance, to defend that balance. And I mean, this is a complex sort of thing, and I don't want to front load the conversation here, but the idea is active citizenship has never been more important in my lifetime than it is today.
From all of the publicly available information that you've seen, and I know you monitor these issues extremely closely, are you convinced that there was a campaign directed from the highest levels of power in Moscow to seek to influence the outcome of the U.S. election?
Yeah, so this is...
And you're speaking to us, of course, from Moscow right now, where...
Right. If the feed gets cut short, you guys know why. You know, this is one of those things where it's frustrating because there's so much smoke. And nobody's willing to point to fire. And I come from the NSA, right? My last position, I was working counter-cyber, finding exactly the kind of hackers that are being sort of alleged in this current moment, but for China rather than for Russia. And I got to tell you, it wasn't real hard to find these guys. So we have this report that came from the DNI and basically three agencies. I think it was the FBI, the CIA, and the NSA. And they said in their finding that they had, confidence that this was the assessment, but there were some really weird things. This has led to this sort of ongoing drama that everybody is focused on. And it's consuming the nation with kind of a passion where we can't focus on anything else. Because we're elevating Russia to a position where they can sort of control our political outcomes. And I think that's actually giving Russia too much credit. I don't think Russia is that strong, right? But when we look at this report, and we think about, obviously Russia would have interest in this, right? Any country would have interest in changing electoral outcomes in other countries. I mean, we do it, why wouldn't the Russians? But the main thing here is the FBI and the CIA both said we have high confidence in this assessment, that basically the Russians did it. And the NSA, who is best positioned to actually make this judgment, said they had medium confidence in this assessment. Now, this is one of those things where, they didn't say we have no confidence. They didn't say we disagree. They said, yeah, we're still nodding our heads. We think about this. But why the discrepancy there? And the only reason that I can think about, and again, I don't know this, and this is the problem when we speak about these things, we need evidence. You can track sort of these, let's call them hacking attempts, from where they're launched, even if the hackers are trying to hide their footsteps, when you have the powers of the NSA, because this is sort of how mass surveillance works, right? When you're watching everything.
You're going out there, Ed. Oh.
Sorry.
The feed actually has become choppy now that you're getting into the details.
Hopefully this is going a little bit better.
It's amazing. You predicted exactly what was going to happen.
It may be, I'm not sure on this, but if we have the feed that we're talking over that's also shared with the audience on their phones, and they're suddenly looking up things like that report to get the confidence numbers, they're choking the stream we're using. So if you're in the audience, let's please try not to download any YouTube videos right now.
As you were, Ed.
But yeah, to simplify this and sort of tie off the point here, when they were looking at the hacking into, for example, the DNC's servers, this is a high-value target. Whether we're talking about the United States, whether we're talking China, whether we're talking Russia, everybody is targeting these institutions if they have the resources, if they have the people. That's their job. And former director of the NSA and the CIA, Michael Hayden, says this. He's actually described this as honorable espionage, which I think is a bit much. But that's his perspective, right? This is what intelligence agencies do. And the problem with this is, so the DNC didn't actually provide their service to the FBI. They contracted this third-party company that's basically paid to provide a explanation that goes, look, this matches these attack indicators, right? Fair enough. We've seen these before. They're attributed to Russians. We think Russians were on the system, right? But that's all they provide. The reality here is if NSA didn't have the same level of confidence, it's very likely it's because there were more people on the system, right? There could be multiple actors there. We can have the French, we can have the Chinese, we can have the Israelis, we can have the Germans, all on the same system, and this happens all of the time. It happens so frequently that in NSA, we have an actual term of art for this, where instead of hacking somebody, we just watch what the hackers who already hacked them are taking, and then we just save a copy of that. It's called fourth-party collection. And because there was so much traffic on this, they couldn't really deconflict it. But this raises the big question of, okay, well, if the Russians didn't do it, who did it, right? And I think this is where it gets dicey, and this is where I start to think, all right, it's probably the Russians, right? Because they're the ones who, in my opinion, right, this is just a personal opinion.
Hold on a minute, Ed.
Start talking about it. Sorry, go ahead.
You said the word Russia again, and then it just started to go choppy. And,
All right.
either that,
Yeah,
or someone's downloading, porn here. But
Right. So look, we'll tie this off because it's going on for a while. There's this allegation, right, that Vladimir Putin and Hillary Clinton basically hate each other, like they're mortal enemies, right? And he wouldn't want to see this. So when you start seeing a cui bono, maybe it's possible. But here's the central problem with everything we've discussed right now. It's entirely speculation. Absolutely none of it is reliable. And previously, when the United States government has seen hacking efforts that they considered threats to national security, they released evidence. When this happened quite recently, in December of 2015, right, Sony was allegedly hacked by the North Korean government. The FBI said this, and everybody went, well, maybe it was the North Koreans, maybe it was these other people. We had this same kind of conversation we're having right now, right, about show proof. And the FBI went, boom, here's our evidence. Here's why we think it was the North Koreans, and they provided this at a press conference about a month later, and suddenly all of these doubts seemed to vanish, and the attribution became pretty firm. This is what's missing. The NSA is spying on everyone, everywhere, all of the time. That's how mass surveillance works. So why is it that we aren't getting evidence about what is arguably the most important public policy question when it comes to sort of foreign intelligence efforts in recent history?
No, part of the reason I wanted to ask you this was not just based on your knowledge of surveillance systems and how the NSA functions, and obviously there's an incredible amount of hypocrisy at play here, given that the United States has a PhD in interfering in elections around the world, and of bumping off and killing elected leaders in some cases. In fact, here today, it's not just the anniversary of 3,000 Americans being killed on 9/11, it's also the anniversary of the coup against Salvador Allende in Chile. There are 9/11s in different parts of the world also that actually have the United States on the side of aggression that are remembered in other nations. And I wanted to ask you, I hope this doesn't get us too far into the weeds, but I wanted to ask you about this so-called Steele dossier. This is the guy who's been presented as a former MI6 agent, Christopher Steele, who was hired by people who were supportive of Hillary Clinton after having worked for apparently some GOP operatives at one point. And then the contents of this so-called dossier that purported to have evidence that there were powerful Russians that claimed that there was compromising information about Donald Trump, that he had these deep connections in Moscow. This is part of where the whole P-tape mythology started to then seep into the mainstream P-tapes. Okay, I really did not mean to do that. I did it, I'm sorry, I apologize to everyone. My question for you is not to go tit for tat through the Steele dossier. Is there any part of that story that in and of itself sort of feels like an operation, that the way that this was presented and leaked to various journalists and the timing of it, without ever having to have any stamp of official authority on it to say, oh, well, the CIA is saying this, and therefore the public can demand evidence. Do you understand what I'm saying? Like, it seems like it's kind of almost a backdoor way of trying to push this information out there without ever having to own it at its source.
Yeah, I mean, again, this just gets into the central problem that I have engaging on these issues, which is I'm not a politician, right? I'm an engineer. We are trained to work with facts, with reality, with truths, with numbers that we can move around, right, and manipulate and actually build something from. When we start talking about just assumptions, which we can't prove anything about, we can't be sure about, you try to build something that falls down, and you try to build something that falls down, you try to build something that falls down. And until we actually start working on facts, we're not going to have something that actually lasts. And this is the biggest problem for me personally, right? It's a very interesting document, right? Salacious stuff. This is the kind of thing that the vast majority of human intelligence is actually about, right? When we talk about what NSA does, signals intelligence, or SIGINT, and then we talk about what the CIA does, or MI6 does, right? Which is human intelligence. Human intelligence is almost entirely just a bunch of guys working out of embassies, or guys who are posing as like business executives. Those are your non-official cover guys. You know, they're treated in the movies, you know, as if they're Tom Cruise or Matt Damon. But in the reality, it's like a 50-year-old overweight guy who just goes out to a lot of meetings. And they talk to people. And then they write reports, right? Government spies are just journalists with a very limited readership. That is the entire work of human intelligence gathering. Signals intelligence, right, is a little bit more concrete because at least you know somebody actually wrote this, right? You may not know directly who wrote it, but you know this is the actual document. It's not someone's description of it. It's not their interpretation of it. This is the actual document. And, you know, I think it's actually damaging for our political environment when we're constantly talking about claims, when we're constantly talking about allegations, and we forget the basic fundamental rules of reasoning, which is that which is asserted without evidence must be dismissed without evidence, or you can't actually start to go toward the truth.
Yeah, I mean, we're in this, you know, I was sort of chatting with you about this earlier today. Glenn Greenwald and I both, you know, we have different views on this. I don't agree with everything that Glenn Greenwald has written about Trump or about Russia. But one common experience that we've had is that when we actually are saying, like, let's assess what the available evidence actually looks like. And, you know, I've had people on my podcast where I press them, you know, including Clint Watts, who now has become, he's a former FBI counterterrorism agent who's now become a regular on MSNBC and testified in front of the U.S. Congress, and one of the leading people saying Russia, you know, without question is seeping into every part of our lives. And he's, you know, he's like a step away from the crazy person Louise Mensch in some ways. I respect Clint Watts in other ways. But pressing them to say, like, what's the single most damning piece of information that you have? And when you listen to it, it's nothing that would even remotely stand up in a court of law. That to me is the issue, not whether or not we want to see Donald Trump go. It has actually nothing to do with Trump as an individual and everything to do with the precedent and the standard that's set. This is the exact idea or concept that got us into the war in Iraq, was constantly, intentionally making assertions without backing it up by evidence. And, you know, I from the beginning have militantly opposed Donald Trump, but to me, you don't base your principles when, you know, your buddies are in office or when the people that you admire are in office, any more than you would base whether you're for or against the death penalty on the case of an innocent person. If it's a principle, you base it on what is the most extreme case and what is my position on it. Donald Trump is perhaps the most extreme case that any of us have seen in our lifetime. And the question to me is more about, do we believe that evidence is necessary? And that's become almost an unacceptable position in the U.S. media today. In fact, one of the only major statements saying that there isn't enough evidence to conclude that happened this week at the Miss America pageant. No, I shit you not. One of the Miss America candidates, there were two amazing moments of the Miss America pageant. One was I don't watch the Miss America pageant. I do want to get your Ed, I'm sparing you here all the questions about your partner that came in on Twitter also, okay? So do me a favor here. Don't get me into the Miss America. And I apologize to people for this. Trust me, it's going somewhere. Miss Texas was asked about Charlottesville and the neo-Nazi violence there against protesters. And she was asked about, this was Miss Texas, was asked about Trump. And she made a clear statement that Trump sent a message that he was on the side of the neo-Nazis by the way that he described. This is Miss Texas at the Miss America pageant. Then they asked another contestant about collusion with Russia. And what do you, I mean, I don't know, maybe because Donald Trump is now president, no longer involved with these pageants, like he's not vetting the contestants anymore. And her answer, the answer to her question about collusion, was smarter than almost anything you'll hear at any random moment on MSNBC, CNN, or Fox. And she was describing exactly the process that you just talked about, saying that I don't believe we have enough evidence to conclude that there was that kind of collusion. The Justice Department should investigate this, and if there's evidence of criminal activity, people should be held accountable. That was a Miss America contestant saying that, not a Democratic or a Republican senator. Very, very briefly, Ed, you are in Moscow. Both times that I've done a public interview with you, people always say, ask Ed, what he thinks of Putin, and someone asked today, what's the most repressive aspect of living in Russia today? I want to ask you your assessment of the Putin government. And I know that I think a lot of people would perceive it as that's putting you in a bad position because you're in Moscow right now. But knowing the sort of character of you as a person, I do want to ask it to you. What's your assessment of Vladimir Putin's record on press freedom, on human rights, on gay rights, an analysis of the Russian government and Vladimir Putin?
Right. So this is, I mean, it's a big, long question.
I'm as long-winded as you, brother.
Right. Let me point to my public record first. I have criticized Vladimir Putin on TV to Vladimir Putin. I have been on Twitter again and again saying that laws that he's passed have been repressive. They've been violations of human rights. At one point, I said a new law was a theft that's robbing every Russian citizen. These are probably dangerous things to say. But they need to be said. We need to speak not because it's safe, but because it's right. Vladimir Putin is not the world's greatest humanitarian. Nobody thinks he's the world's greatest humanitarian. But that doesn't mean that we should stop criticizing. The idea here is when you stop looking, things get worse because it becomes comfortable. And in Russia right now, one of the things that concerns me the most is we see internet freedoms being undermined steadily, repeatedly, and it's being justified on the basis that open societies, Western democracies, are passing the same laws. And let's presume, one of you is in the audience right now and you are drinking the Kool-Aid, right? You work for the CIA, literally. I don't mean this, as an insult, right? But you're literally going in tomorrow, you got to badge in through the turnstile, say hi to the guard, log in, unlock your workstation, do all your little top secret business, and then go back and, hunt down some activists or whatever it is you're doing nowadays. But the idea here is, even if you trust the United States government, or the government of the United Kingdom, which just last year passed the most repressive surveillance law in the history of Western society, the Investigatory Powers Act, or France, which has had a state of emergency that was supposed to be temporary, running for more than a year now, Or Germany, which passed a new reform law that was supposed to be in response to the intelligence agencies breaking the law and violating the rights of Germans. And rather than conforming the intelligence agencies' operations to the law, they changed the law to make the law fit around what the intelligence agencies wanted to do, right? And again, even if you trust these guys to do the right thing, even if you trust them never to abuse their power, to only go after the bad guys, right, to use this exclusively against the Osama bin Laden types, the problem is this. China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, North Korea, Iran, whoever you're afraid of, whoever you don't like, they're not going away. They still exist. They're still paying attention. They're going to pass the same laws, or worse, in their country, and they're not going to apply them as judiciously, shall we say. They're going to use them more aggressively. They're going to be using them more oppressively. And the general sort of tide line of human rights around the world will go down every time we pass an extreme law, even for good purposes, right, with the most noble of intentions. And this gets back into this question of the president, right, this question about Donald Trump. Nobody likes Donald Trump, right? And if you look at the evidence, this is a pretty rational position. That's not meant to be a laugh line. The idea here is this is actually an opportunity for the United States. This is an awakening that's long overdue. The reason we had the disaster of the last decade with the Iraq War, with the Patriot Act, with torture, with Guantanamo, with extrajudicial killings, with the rising inequality, anywhere you look, we have had policy failures that have cost every American and their family either money or rights or liberty or all of the above, right? And these happened because the president had too much power, right? It doesn't matter whether you trust George Bush. It doesn't matter whether you trust Barack Obama. It doesn't matter whether you trust Donald Trump. The reality is an office that is all-powerful will be constantly changing hands between such people. And even if you love the president today, remember the disaster is never more than 4 years away. Right? Elections are constantly coming. And when we have a Congress that is afraid to actually do their job and hold the administration, right, to the account of the public, to investigate these agencies, to have oversight agencies that are actually looking at what the CIA is doing with an eye to upholding the law, rather than for campaign fundraising, which is how it works today, right? They call it the Oversight Committee, but it should be called the Overlook Committee because all they do is they overlook all of the problems that have arisen on their watch. Even the courts, right, which today feel like our lifeline, our last resort, we want our government to succeed. We want our presidents to be good presidents. We want our Congress to pass just laws. But when we see the courts that have controversial issues before them, and they use procedural games to escape having to decide, or they rule on a constitutional question on the narrowest grounds to kick the can down the road another 10 years. That's another 10 years of injustice that we are going to have to live through. This is ultimately about a government that has an extraordinary amount of power and a very limited amount of responsibility in terms of what they feel, right? Not what they have. They're responsible for all of our lives and well-being, but what they feel that they must do. The level of weight that seems to be on their shoulders, when you look at how congressmen talk today from both parties, it seems like it's a game. It seems like they're having a party. Like this is just a joke to them, but it's not a joke. And if somebody doesn't fix it, we're all going to pay for it. Now, the problem is, what happens when the government will no longer fix itself? What happens when we have a president that is emblematic of all of the failures that we have seen over the last decades, now coming to a single conclusion? Ultimately, it comes down to us, we the people. This is why I say active citizenship. I'm not saying advocating or even, getting difficult to talk. I'm not advocating that you make my choices, right? Maybe you disagree with what I did. Maybe you think it was a good thing. But regardless, that was a certain sort of circumstances and a certain kind of life. But I want you to look around every day. I want you to look around right now. I want you to look around when you leave at the world around you and remember that you are not powerless. You don't have a lot of influence, but you don't need to. I am and was no one. I was just a guy at the desk, right? I was not elected. I didn't plan to change the world, right? It was the circumstances that determined the outcome. I saw and held in my hand evidence that the government of the United States was violating the rights of its people. I talked to my coworkers about this. They nodded their head. They thought, yeah, okay, but what are you going to do about it, right? And we all agreed, they were the ones who pointed it out, that if you say something about this, you're really going to pay for it. Boy, did they call that one. But the idea is if all of us do what we can, it will be enough. And this is the critical thing that we have to know. We may not be able to save the world in one stroke. Nobody can, nobody will, but you don't have to. Recognize that enough is enough. There's an old saying that goes, the man who knows enough is enough will always have enough. We have to start somewhere. We're in a bad place right now. We must not remain there.
While I'm waiting here to get some questions from the audience, I wanted to ask you, of course, Hillary Clinton's book is out tomorrow, and Steve Bannon was just interviewed on 60 Minutes. This is a lot of fodder for the chattering class in D.C. But on this issue of Hillary Clinton, do you think that her policies in office would have been markedly different than those of Donald Trump on the core issues that you've focused on? I mean, clearly Hillary Clinton was not going to implement a Muslim ban and repeal or not by executive fiat say, okay, 700,000 people are going to have to leave the United States and go to a country that they've never been to. I mean, there's clear differences, and we can say that Hillary definitely would not have done this, and this of Donald Trump. On the core issues that you've focused on internet security, on espionage, on interference in other countries' democratic processes around the world, on core issues of privacy, would there have been a major difference with Hillary Clinton in power versus Donald Trump?
Well, the reality is we'll never know. But when we look at this in a serious way, right, her positions were very aggressive when we talk about foreign policy. She argued this was about keeping America safe, just as everybody else has. Maybe it would have been better, maybe it would have been worse. But the bottom line is this: trying to play these what-if games, comparing between one candidate and the other from two primary parties, is missing the point. We are getting into this circumstance, this problem, when we are forcing 330 plus million Americans to choose between only two candidates, when we have hundreds of millions of people. It's reasonable to think we should have more choices. People, like the tragedy of this election for so many people, I think, and the only explanation for the result was that people weren't willing to be forced into a choice between these two people. They didn't necessarily like either of them. And so they stayed at home. They didn't go. And there's a lot of people out there who will go, that was the wrong choice, right? You should accept the lesser evil, even though it is still evil, because you get less badness. But that's not what America is about. And if our political party system is causing harm, we need to reform it rather than sort of sweeping it under the rug and saying, that's okay, we just need to choke it down. We're not the kind of country that should be doing that.
All right, we're going to go through some of the questions from the audience here, and maybe just in the interest of time, we can both try to be very brief with our interactions here. Mr. Snowden, has any government tried to extract any concessions or information from you in exchange for a pardon or leniency? Thank you for your courage and heroism.
No. This is one where it would be hard for any other government to do it. But we'll sort of go further here and go into like the is he a Russian spy question.
There's a few of those here coming down the line if you want to wait, but no, go ahead, Ed.
Yeah, let's sort of omnibus that one, but let's start with the U.S. side of things, right? I have had a single condition for risking spending the rest of my life in jail, that is coming back to the U.S. And facing what we all know is likely an unfair trial. And this is that they let me argue my case to the jury, to let them tell the jurors why it is that I did what I did, what resulted from it, how it came to be, and let them decide, was this the right thing to do or not? And the U.S. government has been very careful and very rigid to prevent precisely this from happening. They charge me specifically under laws that prevent me from making my case to the jury. I cannot present what's called a public interest defense. If I say to the jury, I did this because, the prosecution will say objection and the judge will say sustained. This is not a theory. We know this. This happened in the case of Daniel Ellsberg. And Daniel Ellsberg himself, by the way, is the one who tells me, don't go to court. I made the right decision to trust the world for justice rather than a court system, a justice system that now imprisons more Americans than China does, which should alarm us since they have a much greater population. But the central thing here was, I told the Department of Justice, and this was back in the Obama days under Eric Holder, that I would come back on the first plane as long as you say I can make my case to the jury. Give me a fair trial and I will be there. And they sent a letter, signed by Eric Holder, that said, we promise we won't torture you. So on that point, negotiations do exist, but they're not going very far yet.
Do you have that framed somewhere?
No comment. The other thing, right, is all of these other countries, right? Am I making like side deals? Do I have all this under the table stuff? And the answer here is no, by design, right? Even if you don't trust me, this is not a possibility. And this was how the system was laid out. Like, people who weren't really hooked in with the reporting in 2013 may not be aware of this, or they heard about it, but they've forgotten it, or they just heard a lot of these talking heads doing what they do, where they allege and they claim rather than they show and they prove. And this is, I left Hong Kong without any documents. I went to meet the journalists, provided them the evidence that they needed to do their job, right? And then I destroyed my own copy. We have a witness to that, who is a lawyer who has gone on the record to say that. And the whole idea here was, I realized I would have to travel, right, through borders. I was trying to get to Latin America. And I don't know if y'all have ever been to Hong Kong before, but there are no direct flights that way, right? So I had a very complex flight path. There was going to have to transit Russia, which is not exactly known by reputation to be the, shall we say, most hospitable to intelligence officers who are just taking a vacation through it. And so the only way that I could protect myself here, and I say this to protect myself very clearly for a number of reasons. There may be some skeptical people in the audience who go, yeah, that's great, that sounds wonderful, but that maybe there was some game, maybe where you were keeping it in the bag, so that you could be bribed or whatever. But think about the situation that you're putting yourself in. Everyone knows your face. At the time, it's on every channel on the television. You are going through airport security where you literally have no chance to resist this. You'll be doing this not in one country, you'll be doing this in several countries, and only one of them has to get froggy for it to be a bad time. Now, if I had a bunch of secrets with me, I would be the walking equivalent of a piñata. And every intelligence agency whose territory that I went through would want to take their stick, right, and hit me with it until candy falls out. And this is a very serious thing. It's not just a game, right? We try to say this with a light heart so it's not so scary.
And they actually forced down the plane of Evo Morales, the president of Bolivia, because the United States suspected you may be on his plane.
Right, and this is the longer thing about sort of why am I in Russia at all? Some people are under the misapprehension that I actually chose Russia, that I aimed to be here. But again, the ultimate route was Latin America. And when I arrived in Russia, I wasn't allowed to leave because the US government, when they heard I was traveling through Russia, they intentionally canceled my passport, which meant that I could do nothing but apply for asylum, which I did in 21 different countries around the world, places like France, places like Germany. And when these countries basically started to move in the direction, because their public all supported what I did, right? I had basically, even in the United States, a lot of people nowadays think it was the right thing to do. But back then, you've got to remember, there was a sort of a 24/7 news cycle that said this guy's a bad guy. So I was the least popular in the United States. But every other country in the world, right, that had been spied on by the same global mass surveillance apparatus was like, why can't he come here? So they pressured their governments. And every time, you know, the German chancellery or whatever would be getting pressure, the phone would ring. And it would be one of two people. It would be either John Kerry, then Secretary of State, or then Vice President Joe Biden. And they would say, if you let this man in, if you admit him to your country, there will be consequences. We will retaliate, which, by the way, is a violation of human rights, which the United States itself agreed to uphold in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But that's not so interesting for our purposes here. But the idea is, as you said, then when the United States government heard a rumor, right, all these little spies that are reading all of our emails, hear somebody say, Snowy might be on his way to Latin America, hitching a ride with the Bolivian president. The airspace of 4 countries was shut down to prevent it crossing, which is unprecedented, by the way. I think it was Spain, France, and Italy, and one more country I can't recall at the time. He was forced to land in Austria, and he wasn't allowed to depart until he agreed to have the plane searched to see if I was on board. So the question here is not, why am I in Russia? The question is, why is the United States government not allowing me to leave, particularly when they're the ones who claim to be like, oh, this is very suspicious, Russia's a very scary place. Do you want your former employees, right, who worked with mass surveillance to be in the country that you don't trust? Or would you rather them be in Germany, where even if you don't agree with him getting a pass, right, at least you know he's not working out some deal against you? If you look at the actual evidence, the claims that I'm a Russian spy fall apart very quickly. If I am, why the hell am I trying so hard to leave?
There are several questions here about your views, your current views of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks.
Yeah, I mean, this is one that goes back years. WikiLeaks has gone through a lot of evolutions. The WikiLeaks of sort of 2009 with Chelsea Manning's revelations in the Iraq war logs, the State Department cables, the helicopter video of the massacre of Reuters journalists is not the same as the one we saw a few years ago and the one we saw last year. It's constantly evolving. Now, I think WikiLeaks as an organization is still important for the world, right? Now, that may be a controversial statement, but think about it. This is an organization which pressures, by its mere existence, every other news organization in the world to be more forthcoming. Regardless of how you feel about the email publication of last year, regardless of how you feel about any other publication that they did, right? We need to recognize that this is a world where power has a lot of influence over what gets published in the newspaper and what doesn't. And this isn't through the application of law, right? Nobody's saying the FBI is necessarily going into the New York Times and saying, if you publish this story, we're going to arrest you. I don't think that's happening. I think if, right now, we have seen that in previous years, but if that was happening today, I would like to think that the New York Times would actually write that story up and get that out there. But we have commercial pressure, right? We have that sense of reputational concern, where they go, if we publish this, we'll be attacked as partisan. But if a group that's seen as completely out there, like WikiLeaks, publishes it, now they can report on it because someone else has broken the taboo. And now they have sort of free access to these stories that they can report out, to this material that they can report out, without risking their reputation. Now, the side of this is, what do you think about Julian Assange? What do you think about the political sort of machinations between this guy or the organization or whatever? And I think the most important thing here to remember is that regardless of whether he's the most wonderful person in the world or the most foul villain you have ever seen, what ultimately matters is, are the materials that are being reported authentic? Are they real or are they fake? Are they manipulated or are they reliable? If we have this, it doesn't matter why this person published them. That's for us to assess. That's for us to decide how to use. But more information in the public hands is a good thing when we have a world that is increasingly awash with power that does not want to be watched, that does not want to be seen, that does not want to be accountable to voters.
Several people also asked, is there anything, and just to limit this, let's say, is there one thing that you can think of, or that's at the top of your list, if there is such a list, of things you would have done differently in the process of deciding ultimately to take the documents, go to Hong Kong, and provide them to journalists? Is there anything in this whole saga that you would have done differently?
This is going to take a minute, and I know we don't have many. But let me tell you a story. I was a younger man when I began working for the government. I turned 21 in boot camp at basic training in Fort Benning, Georgia. And at a moment when everybody else was out protesting the Iraq War, I had volunteered for it. Why? I was a true believer. I was the guy drinking the Kool-Aid. Despite all of the evidence to the contrary, despite all of the stories, despite all of the commentary, despite all of the controversy, I fundamentally believed the American government would not lie to us. Not that they never lied to us, but about a matter of such serious public importance, because for me it was a simple question of rationality, about reasonableness. You've heard me talk about that a lot tonight. And sometimes this is mistaken, sometimes this is naive, but this is the man that I was then. Was it really rational to risk the public's long-term faith in our government's truthfulness for a short-term advantage in political support for a war? To me, the answer on this was an obvious no, and I would like to hope that people in the room think the same thing. But I was wrong. See, I had grown up in a federal family. My adolescence happened in Maryland, almost within the shadow of the National Security Agency's headquarters. My father was in the Coast Guard for 30 years. My grandfather was an admiral, and then he went
Trump
for a second
just
career at
rebranded the
FBI.
Coast Guard. Trump just talked about how this was great rebranding that he did of the Coast Guard recently in the response to the hurricane. Maybe that wasn't on TV over there in Russia, but big news here, big.
Yeah, and not to belabor the point, but my mom worked for the federal courts, and she still does. And this is kind of ironic because they're the ones that are trying to put me in prison. But that's how it is. Now, I was separated from the Army after an injury, and I began that journey into the government. Right, I worked at the CIA first as a contractor, then a staff officer. Started working undercover overseas, out of the embassies in Switzerland, and then sort of traveling throughout the region. Then I moved on. I started working for NSA on now the electronic side, over in Japan, before coming home, and then ultimately reaching sort of my highest levels of access in Hawaii, where I could see everything everywhere. I could see the CIA network, I could see the NSA network, I could see DIA, I could see whatever. And it was there that I discovered this secret that would ultimately change my life. But think about how many years that took, that progression, to where I was ultimately finally confronted with evidence, and I was finally prepared to recognize it for what it is, that the government was lying. The government wasn't lying once, The government wasn't lying here or there. The government wasn't lying because it was necessary. The government was lying because it was convenient. They were lying all the time. 2013 was not about surveillance. 2013 was about democracy. Mass surveillance is an important issue, but more important was the fact that the Congress was questioning the most senior intelligence official in the United States, General James Clapper, about if the NSA was spying on Americans, if they were collecting any kind of records at all on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans. And he said, sweating, no, sir. They could perhaps coincidentally, accidentally, but not wittingly. And that wasn't true. This is what I would change. This is what I hope you will change if you go into a similar circumstance. I should have come forward sooner. I should have been more skeptical. I don't want anyone in this room to trust me. I don't want anyone in this room to heroize me. I want you to question me to hell and back, and I want you to do the same, not just for whistleblowers who are in precarious situations, right? But for the most powerful members of society who wield the most influence. When we talk about rights, privacy isn't for the powerful. They don't need it. They can assert their rights through 1,000 different mechanisms. They can rewrite our laws. They can buy our politicians. But the powerless, the people who stick out, the people who are a little bit weird, the people who are a little bit different, the people who are a little bit vulnerable, they're the ones who rights are vital for. Because if they don't have them, they're not safe. They're not protected. They are vulnerable to that tyranny of the majority, which always exists in every democracy. It's a part of the functioning of the system. And if you do not develop this skepticism, you will end up in the same kind of circumstances that I am. And by that, I don't mean trapped in Russia. I mean, you will regret not doing something when something didn't smell right, when there was a chance to arrest a slide before it got too steep. And that's the problem with policies, right? That's the problem with mass surveillance. That's the problem with all of these failures of abuse and overreach, whether we're talking about torture, whether we're talking about surveillance, whether we're talking about mass and indiscriminate deportations. When you let them start, and these powerful people become accustomed to that power, to that authority, they become comfortable with it. It begins to feel natural to them. It begins to feel, that word we heard so much earlier in the night, necessary to them. And it becomes almost impossible to claw that power away from them again and restore those liberties back to the public. Don't wait.
Ed, we only have a few moments left, and I think I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about this Equifax breach. But it's also emblematic of the powder keg that is all of this private data about us that is held by so many private corporations. And what's particularly insane about the Equifax situation is that these are the people that can prevent you from ever buying a house because you didn't pay your credit card bill once, and it's like they can't even fucking keep our social security numbers safe. It's like, who are they to tell anyone that they shouldn't be eligible for a car loan ever again? But it reveals something, I think, that I think should be of deep concern to all of us. So many people have willingly given enormous quantities of private personal information to a variety of corporations and government entities. If you look at what's happening with our healthcare system and the digitization of our medical records, but also unwittingly, huge corporations have developed enormous dossiers on all of us that are lying there waiting to be exploited someday, or a breach happens and it ends up out in the open. I've often thought that the company Uber really isn't in the business of trying to make money off of replacing the old yellow cabs, but they're in a data collection business, or at least that's a very important side hustle, and people like Robert Gates are attached to Uber. But in this whole landscape and the data breaches, What is your assessment of that, and what can people do, what should people do to try to confront what is this unprecedented amassing of information about all of us and our private lives?
Well, first, there's two parts to this question. There's the specific case, and then there's the general case. The general case, well, let me start with the specific case. When we talk about Equifax, right, the last count that I saw was the records of 143 million Americans were lost. There's no way that this doesn't happen without negligence. Because the volume of data that is being moved from a system that should not be pushing that much data, right, is very trivially detectable. Imagine you have a hose leading out of your house, right? And somebody can leave the hose turned on and water flows out of the house, but it takes a long time, right, to create thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars of water charges. Now imagine somebody snuck into your house when you were sleeping, and they increased the water pressure on that system so that you have a stream of water shooting out of that hose that's so powerful it actually rips your house off the foundations, pushes it down the block, and you just go out of your house in the morning and drive to work and don't notice it. You don't tell anybody about it. You just go. When you drive back at the end of the day, go, my house isn't there. That's what happened, right? It is ridiculous that this could occur at a company that is so powerful, so influential, so rich. It's naked negligence. But then there's the larger general case here. We are living through the greatest crisis in computer security that we have ever seen. This is the atomic moment for computer science, as we had for nuclear physics in the last century, the last generation, where people who had developed a science, a technology for the empowerment of humanity found that only a few short years later, people began mastering this technology to use it to subjugate people, rather than to lift them up, to press them down, right? And you have to care about this. Yes, we should be angry with the hackers, right? But we should think about how the ecosystem got to this point. We should think about the fact that there are liability laws for every other sector of the American economy. If you build and sell a car, that car has to meet some minimum safety standards. If you develop and sell a new medicine, it has to meet certain minimum safety standards. If you sell a burrito on the street, it's got to meet minimum safety standards. But if you create a credit monitoring system that impacts the lives of basically everyone with a credit card in the United States, there are no minimum safety standards that they are having to deal with. And this goes double for the people who actually write the software in the first place. Now, I don't know where to set the law. I don't know how to change these things. I'm not going to pretend to be the guy with the magic wand and the policy prescription here. But I think we can all recognize that if industry will not regulate itself here, someone else is going to have to do it for them.
All right, Ed, we've reached the end, so very quickly here, recommend for people, and this can be from your recent rotation, one musical artist you like, one book you recently read that you like, one TV show that you and Lindsay watch.
You know, this is
musical artist.
There's a lot in there. For
Come on, Ed.
Book,
wait,
because
let's start with musical artist.
Right now.
Go ahead.
You know, the stuff that I listen to, I don't think anybody's gonna recognize because it's chiptunes. But I don't even know if I can pronounce it.
There you go.
But I think it's Anamanaguchi.
All right, you got applause there.
Okay, we got some fans in the audience.
All right, book.
Book, The Count of Monte Cristo is what I'm reading right now, and it's amazing. I've never had the chance before to read a book at such a luxurious length. But I have to say, it's really life-changing. And hey, who in my circumstance does not appreciate a good revenge tale?
All right, TV show.
This has got to be Mr. Robot. I'm looking forward to the new season that's coming soon on that one because, hey, why not?
It looks like you've built quite a bit of consensus there, Ed. We look forward to your run in exile for president in 2020. Ed also, he just wrote his first peer-reviewed article that I was going to ask him about, but I encourage you guys to look at it online. It's very high up on his Twitter feed right now, so you can find it easily. But the headline of it, or the title of it, is Against the Law, Countering Lawful Abuses of Digital Surveillance. This is a peer-reviewed academic article, and it's the first one that's been published with, it's Bunny Huang and Edward Snowden, so make sure to check that out. Well, Ed, from everybody here at the Free Library in Philadelphia, we want to thank you for joining us tonight, and thank you for your courage and for your honesty and for being willing to play along with some odd questions. Thank you, Edward Snowden.
Thank you. I hope I can see you in person next year.
Try not to blow up the world.